Mark Smith's decision to join a dating site was not made lightly. Weeks of inner turmoil and mounting loneliness had pushed him to a point where he could no longer ignore the need for connection. The anonymity of the internet offered a veil of safety, a way to explore his emotions without immediate judgment. Late one evening, sitting alone in his cab after another long haul, he created a profile. His description was cautious and minimal, reflecting his reserved personality. He listed his profession as a truck driver and spoke vaguely about his love for the open road and solitary lifestyle. Within hours, messages began to trickle in, but most felt superficial or mismatched with his interests until he came across Tom. Tom's profile immediately stood out. Like Mark, he was a truck driver, a profession that demanded resilience and independence. His profile picture showed a ruggedly handsome man with short, salt-and-pepper hair and a confident expression. His bio was straightforward, mentioning his appreciation for long drives, classic rock, and quiet evenings spent unwinding after grueling routes. What truly caught Mark's attention, however, was Tom's sense of humor, subtly woven into his words, hinting at a shared understanding of the unique challenges of their profession. Mark hesitated before sending a message, but his curiosity overcame his reluctance. To his surprise, Tom responded quickly, and their conversation flowed effortlessly. They began by sharing stories of their most challenging routes, laughing about the peculiarities of life on the road, and venting about the frustrations of isolation. The exchanges were lighthearted at first, but as days turned into weeks, they delved into deeper topics. Tom spoke of his struggles with acceptance, both from others and within himself, and Mark found solace in hearing someone articulate emotions he had long buried. For the first time, Mark felt understood. Meanwhile, at home, Lisa noticed the changes in her husband. Mark had always been distant in his own way, but now his absences extended beyond the physical. He spent more time on his phone, often retreating to the garage or his truck to make calls under the guise of work. Their conversations grew shorter, and his gaze seemed perpetually elsewhere. At first, Lisa attributed it to stress from the road, but as the pattern persisted, her suspicions grew. One evening, while Mark was asleep, she found his phone unattended and unlocked. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through his messages, the truth unfolding in the stark light of the screen. The realization was devastating. The next morning, Lisa confronted Mark. Her voice was calm but laced with pain as she informed him of her decision to leave. She packed her belongings and, with their young child in tow, walked out of the house. Mark didn't stop her. He stood in the doorway, watching as his family disappeared into the distance. The weight of his choices settled heavily on his shoulders, but alongside the regret was an undeniable sense of relief. The secret he had carried for so long was now out in the open. With his family gone, Mark's bond with Tom deepened. Their conversations became a lifeline, a source of comfort and reassurance during a time of upheaval. Tom offered him a place to stay, and after weeks of hesitation, Mark accepted. He packed his belongings, leaving behind the house he had once shared with Lisa and stepping into a new chapter of his life. Moving in with Tom felt like both an escape and a surrender. The house was modest but welcoming, tucked away in a quiet rural area far from the scrutiny of neighbors or colleagues. Living with Tom brought a sense of stability Mark hadn't felt in years. They shared routines, dividing chores and spending evenings discussing everything from their routes to their pasts. Mark found solace in Tom's understanding of his world, the long hours, the constant travel, and the unspoken loneliness that came with their profession. For the first time in years, Mark felt a semblance of peace. Yet, beneath the surface, he knew that this new life was fragile, built on foundations that could easily crack under the weight of the truths they had yet to share. Mark Smith adjusted to his new life with surprising ease. Living with Tom brought a rhythm and structure that felt oddly comforting after years of emotional turmoil. Tom's house, a modest but well-kept home tucked away in a quiet rural village, became their sanctuary. The property was surrounded by fields and trees, offering an isolated calm that mirrored the solitude of the open road. Inside, the home was simple but thoughtfully arranged, with a kitchen that smelled faintly of coffee and diesel fuel, a living room filled with well-worn furniture, and a spare bedroom that Mark quickly turned into his own space for moments of quiet reflection. Their daily lives followed a routine shaped by their profession. Both men continued their work as truck drivers, often sharing long hauls and dividing the responsibilities of the job. Tom, being more experienced with the logistics of managing routes and schedules, handled most of the planning. Mark, with his steady temperament and mechanical skills, took charge of maintaining their vehicles. Together, they formed a partnership that extended beyond their personal connection, thriving on the mutual understanding of the demands of their work. When they weren't on the road, they returned to the house, finding solace in the small rituals of domestic life. Tom had a knack for cooking, often preparing hearty meals while Mark tinkered with their trucks or organized tools in the garage. Evenings were spent in quiet companionship, with the hum of a radio or the flicker of an old television providing background noise. These moments, though unremarkable on the surface, carried a significance that Mark had never experienced before, a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he was missing. Yet, despite the contentment he found with Tom, Mark couldn't entirely escape his past. Memories of his family, particularly his young child, lingered in his mind like a shadow. He often wondered how they were doing, replaying moments from his old life that now felt like they belonged to someone else. The guilt of leaving his child weighed heavily on him, creeping into his thoughts during quiet moments. Mark found himself waking up in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling as waves of regret washed over him. He kept these feelings to himself, reluctant to burden Tom with emotions he could barely articulate. Tom, however, was perceptive. He noticed the faraway look in Mark's eyes during their conversations, the way his shoulders tensed when a passing comment reminded him of his child. Understanding the depth of Mark's struggle, Tom made subtle efforts to reassure him. He emphasized the importance of their happiness, urging Mark to let go of the guilt that tethered him to his old life. Tom's words, though gentle, carried a conviction that resonated with Mark, slowly chipping away at the walls he had built around his heart. Despite Tom's support, Mark's transition to this new life was not without its challenges. The routines they shared provided stability, but they also highlighted the differences between them. Tom had long come to terms with his identity and choices, embracing them with a confidence that sometimes intimidated Mark. In contrast, Mark was still navigating the complexities of his emotions, often retreating into himself when the weight of his past became too much to bear. These moments of withdrawal created a tension that neither man addressed directly but both felt acutely. As the weeks turned into months, their bond grew stronger, shaped by shared experiences and the unspoken understanding of their struggles. Mark began to open up, allowing himself to trust Tom in ways he hadn't trusted anyone before. The safety and acceptance he found in their relationship became a foundation for his healing, helping him reconcile parts of himself he had long denied. Yet, underneath the surface of their growing connection, the unresolved threads of Mark's past lingered, a quiet reminder that the life he had left behind was never truly gone. Mark and Tom had just completed a grueling week-long route when they decided to unwind at a roadside bar not far from their home. The establishment, dimly lit and filled with the smell of stale beer and fried food, was a known gathering spot for truckers. The walls were adorned with faded posters of classic trucks and maps of interstate highways, a nod to its primary clientele. For most of the night, they sat in a corner booth, enjoying the anonymity the setting provided. They spoke in low voices, sharing stories from the road and exchanging quiet laughter. For a brief moment, the bar felt like a neutral ground, a place where they could simply be themselves without the weight of judgment. That illusion was shattered when a group of men entered, their loud voices cutting through the hum of the bar. Mark immediately recognized them as old acquaintances from his trucking days, men he had shared countless miles with on the road. Their presence instantly put him on edge. These were not the type of men who would accept his new life without scrutiny. He kept his head down, hoping they wouldn't notice him, but it didn't take long for one of them to spot him and approach their booth. The initial interaction was civil enough, but the atmosphere quickly shifted as the men picked up on the dynamic between Mark and Tom. Their subtle glances and smirks soon gave way to pointed remarks and thinly veiled insults. The tension in the air was palpable, and Mark could feel Tom stiffen beside him. The group's tone grew louder and more confrontational, their words laced with hostility. They didn't need to say much for their disdain to be clear. One of the men, a burly trucker named Ray who Mark had worked with years ago, took things further. He leaned in closer, his words sharp and biting as he directed his attention to Tom. The insults turned personal, targeting Tom's appearance and presumed weakness. When Tom refused to react, Ray escalated his behavior, invading his space and making a show of his dominance. Mark's temper, already stretched thin by the situation, snapped. Without thinking, Mark stood and pushed Ray away from Tom. The movement was enough to spark chaos. Ray retaliated, and in an instant, the bar erupted into a full-blown brawl. Tables and chairs were overturned as punches were thrown, the sounds of breaking glass and shouting filling the air. Other patrons scrambled to get out of the way, while a few cheered on the fight. Mark fought with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed, driven by a mix of anger and a desperate need to protect Tom. Tom, too, defended himself, though his focus remained on pulling Mark back rather than escalating the violence. The fight raged on until the bar owner, a grizzled man with a commanding presence, intervened. He shouted above the chaos, threatening to call the police if the men didn't stop immediately. Reluctantly, the combatants backed down, their breaths heavy and faces bruised. The group of truckers, though still muttering insults under their breath, eventually left the bar. Mark and Tom remained behind, shaken and bloodied. On the drive home, the car was filled with silence. Both men were lost in their thoughts, replaying the events of the evening. The physical pain from their injuries was secondary to the emotional toll the encounter had taken. For Mark, the night was a stark reminder of the prejudice and aggression that awaited them outside the walls of their home. For Tom, it was an unsettling confirmation of how fragile their safety truly was. Once home, they tended to each other's wounds in silence, the unspoken weight of the evening hanging heavy in the air. Mark's hands trembled as he cleaned the cuts on Tom's face, his mind racing with a mixture of guilt and anger. He knew the fight could have been avoided, but he also knew he couldn't have stood by and done nothing. The events of the night left him questioning how much of his past he could truly leave behind and whether the life they were building together was strong enough to withstand the forces trying to tear it apart. The house was steeped in an oppressive silence as Mark and Tom tended to each other's wounds from the bar fight. The dim light in the kitchen illuminated their tired faces, marked with fresh bruises and shallow cuts. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, a stark contrast to the tension that hung between them. Neither man spoke as they worked. Mark held a damp cloth to Tom's temple, carefully wiping away dried blood, while Tom wrapped a bandage around Mark's knuckles with methodical precision. The unspoken emotions between them were as raw as their injuries. Mark felt the weight of the night pressing down on him, not just from the fight but from the realization of how fragile their life together truly was. The confrontation at the bar had unearthed questions he had been avoiding for months. He had fought to defend Tom, not just against their aggressors but against the judgment of a world that would never fully accept them. Yet, as he sat across from Tom, he couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered unspoken between them. Breaking the silence, Mark began to talk, his voice low and hesitant. He spoke about his past, about the first time he had been with a man and how that experience had changed the course of his life. He recounted the confusion, the fear, and the guilt that had followed him for years. He explained how those emotions had shaped his decisions, including his choice to leave his family. Tom listened intently, his expression unreadable, though his hands moved more gently as he worked. Mark's confession was not just an explanation but an attempt to bridge the gap between them, to make sense of everything that had led them to this moment. When Mark finished, Tom sat quietly for a long time before finally speaking. His voice was calm, but there was a tremor beneath it, a sign of the burden he had carried for so long. He began to tell his own story, starting with his early years on the road and the isolation that had defined his life. He spoke of fleeting connections and empty encounters that had never filled the void within him. Then, haltingly, he revealed the truth about the young man from the truck stop. Tom explained that he had known the young man for months, meeting him during his stops at various rest areas. What began as casual transactions had evolved into something deeper for Tom. He had fallen for the boy, believing there was a chance for something real between them. But when he confessed his feelings, the young man had rejected him, explaining that their encounters were strictly business. Tom described the pain and humiliation he had felt in that moment, the anger that had consumed him. He admitted that in a fit of jealousy and desperation, he had confronted the young man one final time. That confrontation had ended in violence, and Tom had left the body behind in the shadows of the lot. As Tom spoke, Mark felt a cold chill settle over him. The man he had come to love, the man who had provided him with a sense of stability and belonging, was confessing to murder. Mark's mind raced as he tried to reconcile this revelation with the person he thought he knew. He felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal, but also a flicker of understanding. He knew what it was to be consumed by emotions that defied logic, to make decisions driven by fear and pain. Yet, understanding did not absolve Tom of what he had done. Tom finished his confession with a quiet resignation, his eyes avoiding Mark's. He didn't try to justify his actions or plead for forgiveness. Instead, he sat in silence, waiting for Mark's reaction. Mark stared at him, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger, sorrow, and doubt. The man sitting across from him was no longer just his partner, but someone who had committed an act that couldn't be undone. The foundation of trust between them had been irrevocably cracked. The rest of the night passed in strained silence. Mark retreated to the spare bedroom, his mind replaying Tom's words and the implications of what he had learned. The person he had built a life with was now a stranger, and the weight of that realization was unbearable. As the first light of dawn crept into the house, Mark lay awake, knowing that the decisions he made in the coming days would determine the course of both their lives. Mark spent the following days in a state of unrelenting turmoil. Tom's confession weighed heavily on him, a dark truth that tainted every interaction between them. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison of silence and unspoken tension. Mark tried to rationalize Tom's actions, telling himself that loneliness and rejection could drive people to desperate measures. He replayed Tom's words, his voice breaking with regret, and tried to find traces of the man he had trusted and cared for. But no matter how much he wanted to forgive, the knowledge of what Tom had done lingered like a festering wound. At night, Mark lay awake in the spare bedroom, his thoughts a chaotic mix of anger, guilt, and sadness. He questioned his own complicity, wondering if his presence in Tom's life had somehow fueled his actions. During the day, he avoided eye contact with Tom, their conversations reduced to functional exchanges about mundane tasks. Tom, for his part, seemed to sense the growing distance between them. Despite his outward calm, there was an unspoken resignation in his demeanor, as though he knew their relationship was unraveling but had no strength left to stop it. Mark's internal conflict intensified with each passing day. He understood the weight of Tom's pain, the isolation that had shaped his decisions, but he couldn't reconcile that understanding with the cold reality of murder. The young man's death was not an abstract event, it was a life extinguished, a crime that could not be undone. Mark found himself staring at the phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad, torn between loyalty to Tom and the need to do what was right. The struggle consumed him, leaving him irritable and withdrawn. Finally, Mark reached his breaking point. Early one morning, he packed a small bag with a few essentials and left the house without a word. The drive to the police station was long and silent, the hum of the engine the only sound. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he fought against the fear gnawing at him. He knew that by coming forward, he was exposing himself to scrutiny, not just as Tom's partner, but as someone who had hidden the truth for days. The prospect of his personal life becoming public didn't deter him. He had accepted that the cost of his silence was too great to bear. At the station, Mark recounted everything he knew about the murder. His voice was steady, though his heart pounded with each detail he revealed. He described the events leading up to Tom's confession, his own hesitation, and the moral struggle that had led him to this moment. The officers listened carefully, their expressions unreadable, as they took his statement. When they asked if he had any evidence to corroborate his account, Mark handed over the few personal items that tied Tom to the crime, items he had reluctantly gathered from the house. With each passing minute, the weight on his shoulders lifted, replaced by a cold, hollow clarity. Later that day, Tom was arrested. Mark wasn't there to witness it, but he imagined the scene, the quiet resignation in Tom's eyes, the understanding that this was inevitable. Mark didn't return to the house. Instead, he checked into a small roadside motel, the anonymity of the setting providing a temporary refuge. As he sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the flickering television, he felt a strange mix of relief and loss. He had done what he believed was right, but the cost was undeniable. The next morning, Mark returned to the road. Driving had always been his way of processing, the steady rhythm of the miles giving him space to think. As the landscape blurred past, he reflected on the choices that had brought him here. He thought of Lisa and his child, of the life he had built and abandoned. He thought of Tom, of their brief happiness, and the darkness that had ultimately consumed them. There was no sense of triumph in his actions, only a quiet acceptance of the consequences. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Mark felt a glimmer of clarity. He had lost much, but he had also gained something intangible, a sense of freedom that came from facing the truth, no matter how painful. He knew the road ahead would be uncertain, filled with challenges and moments of doubt. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. The horizon stretched endlessly before him, a reminder that while the past couldn't be changed, the future was still his to shape.